There's so much that we can learn by looking at both romance novels and the people who write them. The community of romance writers is a microcosm of American society. It's full of controversy. It's full of people who want the best for the world. It's also a place where imagination can help us envision the world that we want.
Yeah, like it's a place where utopia is imaginable. That's always what I have loved about thinking about the purposes of romance and of entertainment more broadly, but like the idea that, oh, there could be a world in which women's pleasure is taken seriously.
Exactly.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Christine Larson, professor at University of Colorado Boulder and author of Love in the Time of Self-Publishing, How Romance Writers Change the Rules of Publishing and Success.
As you know, each week we take a piece of the culture that surrounds us and we really look into it from as many angles as possible. And we're trying to figure out what it says about the world we live in. And today is part 2 of a conversation about romance novels. Back in June, we talked to romance novelist Nisha Sharma about tropes, about diversity and representation on the page, about whether you should be concerned when reading romance novels makes you question your love life, so many things. Part 3 of this series will be out next month, and it'll be all about the business of selling romance. But today, we're looking specifically at the readers and writers and the publishing industry itself. So I am so excited to talk to you, Chris, about the work that you have done analyzing this industry, the larger romance community, the ethos of care and of work that is all around romance writing. And then also, because you are a cultural scholar as well, we can think about the purposes of romance and why romance is the way that it is, and some of these larger questions that our readers and listeners have posed for us. So let's start with your book, Love in the Time of Self-Publishing. Tell me how it came about, because I really love this story.
Oh, yeah, the origin story. So I was a journalist for a long time, and then I wanted to study how digital technology, social media was changing journalism and the messages that we heard in the world. So like many other women in their 40s, I had little kids, but I wanted a life change, and I started going to grad school to study these things and get my PhD. And during that time, my second year of grad school, I was blindsided by a divorce that I did not want or expect. And I found myself, after I got everybody stable, I had 2 little kids. I have twin boys. They were 8 at the time. I finally sat down one day to do my research, which I had put aside for a few months, and I couldn't write. I never had writer's block before, and I just couldn't get excited about what I was studying with journalism. And that day, sitting and staring at this blank screen, I remembered that an author I had interviewed told me that only romance writers were making money in the new world of digital publishing. This was around 2012, 2014. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I'm going to dive into that. Maybe that's a project that will get me going again. And I was so fortunate. I began to just cold call romance writers who were self-publishing. They were unbelievably generous. They were excited to help explore why romance had become more popular than ever. And the women I met really, in some ways, they don't know this, but they kind of helped me rebuild my life. Because they were so inspiring, and they had been through so much themselves, and they were still writing and raising families in some cases, and they were just so strong and smart and helpful that I could not stop studying them.
And so let's see, you did, was it like 70, 80 in-depth interviews with authors, right?
Yes, I talked to 80 authors and 20 or more editors and other publishing executives and experts.
And you sent out a survey that got more than 4,000 responses. Is that right?
The survey is a testimony to how interested romance writers are in their own business.
Yeah.
I sent it to 10,000 people, every member of RWA at the time, Romance Writers of America. And I got a 42% response rate, which is unheard
It's wild.
of. Yeah.
I bet you brag about that at conferences, right?
You know what? I'm kind of scared about it because I will never be able to get that kind of response again. But it really is a testimony, to the authors themselves.
To me, it also speaks to the fact that so many writers were so eager to talk to you and generous with their time, and that extends to the survey as well, that I think people want to talk about it. They want this work to be taken, it's not just like taken seriously by men, but also like it's interesting how you make a living by writing books. It's really interesting. And I think that it's understudied. And so having the chance to talk shop essentially is really fun. And when I was a scholar, there wasn't as much acknowledgement about how eager people actually were to talk about these kind of nitty-gritty components of the way that they do their work.
Well, I have to confess that romance writers are an especially easy group to study because they have 40 years of tradition of helping each other and helping other women writers, and also sharing openly information about their business, about how much they earn, about their secrets of writing a great story. They're used to sharing all this. And so they were very interested and responsive, which is great for a researcher, as you know.
Yeah. When I was rereading the intro this morning, and there was this part of it where you talk about how supportive and how eager different romance writers were to share the tricks of the trade with each other, particularly navigating going independent. And I sent a quote from you to my text thread that I share with a bunch of other independent Substack writing journalists, because the reason we have this text thread, like I have never met any of the women on this thread in person, but we talk every single day. And even though like we're writing kind of in the same sphere, like you could think of us as in competition, but I don't think we think of each other as in competition. But we help each other and have always been eager to help each other because it's a way forward that feels sustainable when the rest of the industry feels so incredibly precarious. And so I really, I just saw so many parallels between what you were seeing. And it makes sense since you were originally thinking about what was happening with the freelancification of the journalism industry that led you to this work.
Yeah, and what I found in my own freelance career was that social networks were unbelievably important. It was through a writers group where people were incredibly generous with contacts with editors that I began writing for places like the New York Times and U.S. News and World Report, just because other writers were really generous in sharing their contacts. And those were, maybe not coincidentally, almost entirely women who helped me. So I was seeing the same thing that you're seeing in your networks, and the same thing that we see with romance writers.
For people who don't read romance, why are these findings, why do they matter for our society? Why is this important? Even for people who are don't necessarily denigrate romance, but are why should I care about romance?
People should care about romance because romance writers teach us a lot about how we can work and survive and thrive in this gig economy. So on the one hand, this is a book about how romance writers found each other and succeeded over 40 years. But at a deeper level, it's really a book about labor networks and self-organization and mutual aid. So if you're an independent creator of any type, whether that's a writer, a musician, an influencer, a streamer, an independently employed lawyer, and if you want to be treated fairly as an independent worker, you really need to build the kind of community that romance writers developed.
Is it just that it's feminized? It's a feminized form of labor that this different mode of work developed? I really appreciated in the book how you talk about the way that we organized work, the way that we have organized work historically doesn't have to be that the way that we organize work. Like there are other ways that we could have figured out as our status quo of how we think about and organize labor in our lives, and even just like how we reward it. And that's happening. It has happened, perhaps out of necessity, but also maybe because of other factors in the romance community. Is it just because it's an undervalued form of labor? What's going on, do you think?
Yeah, a lot of things were going on. And just like romance novels are a world where we can imagine how things might be different, romance writing labor is a world where people did imagine how things can be different.
Yeah.
And I found that the social networks of romance writers were very open, and that people who had succeeded, best-selling authors, are happy to chit-chat with up-and-coming authors. And I think that reflects the way women's work has operated for decades. And I should pause and say, when I say women's work, we have to remember that white women, white middle-class women, worked in very different ways from Black women or other minoritized communities. So there's a lot of subtleties there that I go into in the book. But for most of these, almost for all of these communities, women have always worked in a piecemeal fashion, literally done piecework, taking in work while they're raising their children, and they've always helped each other. We think about quilting bees, or we think about women caring for each other's children so people could work. And that kind of cooperation and openness is reflected in the way that romance writers work. And, I often say that the gig economy should really be called the women's economy, because we have always worked without health benefits, without employment security. And as you pointed out, the way that we still envision work is really based on a particular model that was started at the turn of the century, the idea of working 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year for 40 years with someone at home that is a wife who's taking care of everything else. That model has been reimagined more broadly, but also especially by women.
Well, and then one thing that you didn't mention is that but that is implicit, is that in these scenarios, part of the reason that you want to help other women who are writing romances is that you think of the sphere of the publishing industry as a place where there are not just one winner, right? That we are not all in competition, and that if one person wins, everyone else is a loser. It's like there is a lot of space for all of us to win and to create, material, to create narratives that people want to consume. It's not a winner take all scenario.
Well, that's interesting. That's exactly how romance writers have always approached the industry.
That there's enough room for everyone.
Yes, which is contrary to how a lot of writers and how the traditional publishing industry actually works.
Yes.
The traditional publishing industry operates on a superstar model. They would much rather sell 1 million copies of one book than a few copies of, 1 million books. So romance writers have really worked against that trend for a long time. And we especially saw that in the rise of self-publishing.
Right. And because self-publishing says, if I create material, there will be an audience for it, essentially, right? If I there is enough audience to go around to all of these different places, instead of the publishing companies decide who is worthy, which, and we can get into this in our later questions, but who is worthy for so long was exclusively white authors writing white narratives, right? With straight protagonists.
Yep, exactly.
So the way that the work is organized also has all of these other trickle-down effects that we're going to talk a lot about. Right. So we put out a call to our listeners for questions, and we kept it really general. And I mean, I knew this before. We have so many listeners, readers of Culture Study, who are very well-versed and very interested in romance. So we got a ton of submissions, and they really ran the gamut. but we figured out some questions that I think are particularly well suited to you. So let's get to them. This first one is from Hannah.
I have always loved romance novels, but when the pandemic hit, I became fully addicted to all books with a romantic focus. I am a cisgendered single woman in my late 20s, and my other female friends have also admitted to romance novel obsessions, no matter their relationship status or sexual orientation. Yet, as far as I know, none of my male friends are reading romance at all. I think they're just all playing video games. Why aren't men reading romance at the same rate as women? Has it always been this way? To what extent is the boom in romance novels tied to how women are taught about heteronormativity and the patriarchy, which often contrasts with the reality of being a woman living in the 21st century?
All right. So can you give us like a little bit of a taste of the answer to the first part of this question? I know there have been like many books written on this. So like who has been reading romantic narratives, we'll use as like a larger umbrella historically, and how has that changed?
So I'll back up a bit and I'll say that the publishing industry has always devalued women's writing from as long as American publishing has been an industrial endeavor. Women's writing has always been super popular and devalued as less important than male writing. And that is still true today. So romance has been very popular for more than 100 years. And it has always been women who read it more. And part of that is because culturally, emotions and emotional life have been devalued by male culture and been considered part of the women's sphere. So men are socialized to put their time and attention to other kinds of important endeavors and important reading. That is still true today, and we see this in the fact that men read much less fiction than women. They read, in general, less than women do. As that's especially true in romance. 82% of romance readers are women. About 18% are men. More men are reading romance now, though. And I think that's in part because young adult literature, YA literature, had a boom about 15 years ago. And both young men and young women became more interested in reading in general.
Yeah, and it connects to me with like even the way that they very simply identified a lot of weepies back in like the 1930s, 40s, 50s as women's pictures, right? Because the emotional world, the access to the emotional world in these pictures and coming out of Hollywood was like specifically identified as women's films, even though what was more of what we think of as like the rom-com, which was then called the screwball, was universally appealing. But I also think too, and this is so broadly sketching, but like so much of what is imagined in the romance novel is a different way that things could be, right? It's a world where, again, as we talked about before, where women's pleasure is taken seriously, where women are able to reconcile desires for family and sex and partnership and in some cases work. And under patriarchy, you don't get those things. And maybe dudes, not all dudes, but some dudes are like, why do I need this fantasy space? Everything's fine.
Everything's just fine.
Or they've convinced themselves everything's fine.
Well, one of the pioneering scholars of romance, Janice Radway, wrote a book called Reading the Romance in 1980. And she did come to the conclusion that one of the reasons that romance was so popular with women readers is because it did give them this space of resistance. And this was coming out of the women's movement. And the women's movement was portrayed as big protests and people burning their bras and stuff like that. But there was a massive number of readers and just women who that wasn't accessible. That wasn't a way that they could work on changing the culture because they're embedded in families. They like their families. But it was a way that they could get time for themselves to imagine a different world. And that's really important.
Yeah, and that always reminds me too of like the phrase that often comes up in scholarship of melodrama of women's pictures and weepies in the 20s, 30s, 40s is that they were wasted wet afternoons, right? Like the idea that a woman could go waste an afternoon crying at the movie theater in her own sphere, right? Like that felt like revolution, like, or what you could carve out for
Yep.
yourself. And I loved reading it when I was in grad school, reading Janice Radway's Reading the Romance, because for me, this was 10 years ago. This is before this current, what I think of as this current romance boom. And I still had a lot of hangups about like I associated romance very strongly with like Harlequin romance and had class stuff going on there. And then also some like pretty basic feminist politics that were like, oh, these novels are retrograde in some way and thus like they're not worthwhile. And what Radway is able to recover there in those interviews is that even if the narratives themselves might seem retrograde and patriarchal in all these different ways, the act of reading itself is doing something different. And I think there's an element of that going on even today, right?
Right. But also that way of viewing reading, like, well, we can't read romance novels because they are retrograde.
Yeah.
Stuart Hall, the cultural theorist from England, argued that there are different ways to read. So there's the dominant reading, there's the dominant story, and there's the resistant way of reading. And so as readers, we get to interpret this however we want. And yeah, maybe they get married and there's a happy ending, but also the woman gets a job or she gets to buck some cultural trends and change the system while keeping sex and love and imagining that as a positive thing.
Yeah.
And this resistant way of reading has been especially important for Black readers because there were so few romances that featured Black protagonists. The publishing industry really did not imagine happy endings for Black women until quite recently. So they've always been doing this resistant sort of reading.
Would you say that these resistant modes that like, or what you could uncover in the text through a resistant reading, that it's become more explicit in a lot of the more recent romance? Because I see that in a lot of like queer romances, historical queer romances, much more sex forward historical romances where before you could like imagine that maybe they were having sex, like, but now like you just know that they are, that sort of thing. Yeah. What do you think?
So I'm not sure I would say that the resistant reading or the liberation reading is totally dominant because at the end of the day, a romance is a story about two people who meet, who are attracted to each other, they encounter difficulties, and they end up together. So that is a very heteronormative story.
Yeah.
So we will always be able to criticize romance narratives for that, and we should. But at the same time, the liberation reading is there and probably more dominant than it was. Actually, now I'm contradicting myself, but you've made me think. So that's a good conversation.
And because I am not as well versed, Melody, the producer of our show, has given me a beginning syllabus that she calls like not even like putting your toe in the ocean. It's like driving to the beach. Like that's how cursory it is. And I'm so excited to be on this journey, but also a lot of the really great stuff that she has given me or that others have suggested to me are books that are doing this really interesting and cool stuff.
Yeah.
And for me, I don't know how representative that is when there's so much out there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, like they say, you've read one romance, and it's like, and there's gonna be a lot of romance using the same trope or the same settings, but then there's a completely different world that uses totally different tropes. And so, if you're a sci-fi lover, you could just read romance sci-fi. If you are a fantasy lover, you can just read romantasy. It's very hard to dip your toe in because there's just so much.
So this is a great segue to another question, which comes from Marie.
It's been awesome to see more diversity in mainstream romance publishing. More lesbian, gay, bisexual, and neurodivergent characters, and more mental health representation, for example. What can the romance industry tell us about our society based on who is and is not represented in the genre?
Okay, so Marie specifies mainstream romance publishing, but is it safe to assume that the roots of this representation comes from more marginalized writers who are making waves in self-publishing?
That is absolutely true. Actually, as far back as the 50s, Zora Neale Hurston was saying, well, publishers will publish anything that they think they can make money off of. But publishers also assume that the reader, they imagined, the reader only wanted to read sad minority stories. They only wanted to read about the Black struggle. And therefore, she wrote, traditional publishers are not interested in publishing Black romance. Or at the time, she also said Jewish romance or any romance of a group that's just supposed to be oppressed and miserable all the time. We should only publish books about that sad struggle story. Self-publishing completely broke through that, completely got rid of those narratives, because traditional publishers still, they were very locked into this idea of who their reader was and what their reader wanted. And romance writers said, no, I've got these manuscripts that I haven't been able to get published because I have 2 Black characters, or because I have queer characters, or just because the gatekeepers didn't think it would sell. And they sold like crazy. So much so that many romance writers today don't even want to have a traditional publisher because they're doing so well in self-publishing. And that really eventually has pushed traditional publishers to change.
Yeah, because they're like, oh, these people are making money. What if we do this as well, right? Well, and it strikes me, I mean, the publishing industry is so conservative. And by conservative, I don't mean necessarily like politically conservative, although there is that as well. But I mean conservative as in they have such a limited idea of what a reader would like, when this entire genre is based on people imagining worlds that aren't their own, right? Like there is so much space to be pushed into, right? And so someone who, like me, who's like, I'm not interested in fairies, and then reads spends a whole week of my life just reading about fairy romances.
Right.
Like there's just so much room to grow if you're just pushed in slightly a different direction. And it's hilarious to me that the people who hold the purse strings, who take risks all the time on other types of writers, as long as it's a dude usually, right? They wouldn't understand that there's a lot of room for experimentation in this genre.
Yeah, and traditional publishers haven't really understood the readers the way that romance writers understand their readers. And that made a huge difference.
Will you say more about that?
Yeah. So in the book, I write a lot about Romancelandia, which is the fandom, the vast and sprawling romance fandom. And that fandom includes all romance writers, because every romance writer started out as a romance fan. And Janice Radway pointed this out too, like 40 years ago, that romance writers and readers have a uniquely close bond. If you go to a romance conference, you will stand in line at Starbucks behind a best-selling author, and they will be happy to chat with you. If you go to Comic-Con, you wait in a long line and pay to get somebody to sign your book. And this bond between readers and writers is one of the several factors that made self-publishing so successful for romance writers. I once interviewed Marie Force, who is a very well-established self-published romance writer, and she said, publishers didn't want my books. The only people who wanted my books were my readers.
That works out that way, doesn't it?
Exactly. So
Our next question is pretty foundational to this episode about whether or not there's even a boom in the first place. This comes from Moth, and Melody's going to read it.
Are more romance novels actually being published, or is the audience for them just more visible due to them being online, like Book Talk and BookTube? If more books are being published, does this correlate with the lack of widely distributed mid-tier romantic comedy movies?
All right, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because I think, as with all of the publishing industry, it is notoriously difficult to know how many books are being published or sold or bought because of the differences in physical books, audiobooks, Kindle books, self-publishing. People ask me all the time how, like, for books that I've published, how's it selling? I was like, I have no freaking idea. Like, literally no idea. And so we have some sales numbers to show that, at least with what we're able to get, that there has been an increase in the last few years. But what about the proportion of romance published compared to other genres? Like, what is your thinking about tracking here?
I cannot tell you the answer to how many books are published, because romance books are published, because nobody can. And one of those reasons, nobody can. And I've tried. I've been studying romance writers for 7 years. So there are reasons why I can't answer that question. One is the publishing industry is less interested in how many titles they publish than how many books they sell. Yeah. So, and again, as I said, they would rather sell more copies of fewer books. Yes. So it's actually hard to even get from traditional publishers the numbers of how many books they published this year versus last year. And you can get those figures, but I don't have them in front of me. But a vast number of romances are self-published now. Because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of really big authors are not that interested in traditional publishing. So there is no way to count the number of self-published romance. Again, believe me, I have tried, but Amazon sells the vast majority of self-published books, and they're very, very stingy about releasing any figures at all.
Yeah, so like the individual authors might have some insight into how much they have sold vis-a-vis Amazon, but you, as someone studying, would have to reach out to all those authors in order to get a larger picture, and that's just impossible. It's
impossible. People have tried. Yeah. But what I can tell you is about sales, and we do know that from traditional publishers, these figures are tracked. We have seen massive growth year over year since the pandemic. So at a time when book sales in general are shrinking, we're seeing 20% growth, sometimes as much as 50% growth in sales. And some of that is driven by huge bestsellers like Colleen Hoover. Yeah. And some of it is just that there's so much romance out there that once people get hooked, they stick with it. And they read
There's a whole
lot.
sea. There's a whole sea.
Yeah.
What do you think about Moth's theory that this increase in romance novels correlates with the lack of new rom-com movies?
Yeah, that's I really want to have a long conversation with Moth someday, because this is a fantastic question. First of all, I think that's a question well worthy of more academic study. I only study the publishing industry, and I know that from my much more superficial work in other cultural industries, different forces drive the publishing industry than drive the movie industry. And there's been a massive, massive change in the way that we watch movies and who's funding movies. And while there may be contraction in the number of like rom-coms that have mass distribution to movie theaters, we're seeing an explosion on Netflix and Amazon and Bridgerton. Huge.
Yeah, that's a romance.
Could have been several movies, right? So
yeah. No, I agree with you, and I think that as the film industry, what we think of as like movies that go to theaters, has stratified into like super cheap micro production that then make a lot of money, and then these massive tentpole blockbusters that then we have this impulse, like all of the energy around rom-coms doesn't go away, goes into
moves somewhere else.
Yes, it goes into series cable, straight to VOD movies, Hallmark movies, which there's more than ever before, and other networks have tried to emulate the Hallmark movie formula. And then I do think that there's probably some spillover. You're like, oh, I can't, like, when I was growing up, some of my rom-com energy or like my romance energy was really firmly directed towards like watching, whether it was like, I don't know, My Best Friend's Wedding on repeat, right? Like there was some of that was going on. And I think if that's not available to you and you do find it in books, then maybe it stays in books and drives that market a little bit more. But I don't think it's as simple as, yeah. Okay, so we got a lot of questions about Book Talk's involvement. For people who don't know, Book Talk refers to the community of readers and reviewers on TikTok, which can often make or break a book by word of mouth. Like it can just lead to an explosion of interest in a book. Let's hear this question from Mary.
Do you think that the existence of Book Talk is actually helping to destigmatize the genre of romance for the broader public? And is that something that we actually need, or is it enough to feel safe and seen by other members of the romance reading community?
Fascinating question. So how would you chart, if we had to, like chart the stigma of reading romance over the years?
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, charting the stigma, that's a big question.
You're right.
But what's interesting is that this stigma of romance, which was huge in the 80s, romance is the world's most stigmatized genre. Everyone loves to make fun of romance, and romance writers. Scholars have written about this. The Simpsons, there's a funny episode where Marge Simpson is writing a silly romance. So that stigma dates back a long time. What's interesting about the stigma now, though, is that it really infused this younger generation of readers. So readers in their teens thought about romance as these bodice poppers that their grandmother read.
Yep.
But then through TikTok, they've been exposed to, oh, romance is not what I thought it was. Romance is like smart, funny, witty characters. And Book Talk has been huge in the rise of LGBTQ plus romance, because suddenly all these young readers who thought romance is just for,
boring
old,
straights.
middle-aged, boring straights. Trying to think of a nicer way to say that, but why? They're like, oh, I see. It's really different than I thought it was. And then that creates this virtuous cycle where younger readers want things and they want more of these great books, and they're actually willing to go out and buy them. And so publishers are totally responding to what's happening on Book Talk.
Do you think that people just generally, not just younger people, but even older people, are more open about reading romance now than they used to be?
I think they are. One, because there has been so much coverage in the media about how romance has changed, about the fact that it is this rich play space to imagine happily ever afters for almost anybody. And it's fun. So yes, I think that has spilled over, but the growth in romance readers that we've seen in the last 5 years, really since the pandemic, has largely been in the 20-something age group. Previously, romance was most read by women in their late 30s, 40s, and now it's a younger demographic.
That is so interesting, right? Because like late 30s, 40s is like, especially if you're married or maybe not married, but disillusioned with romance, like with real life romance, right? And with your options. Whereas 20s, I think now there are more people who are like, oh, I'm already disillusioned. Or maybe I could imagine a different space. Also with 20s, like sometimes we disarticulate this from reading habits too. I think someone's 20s is often a difficult time to find or recover a joy of reading that you might have had as a teen when you had a little bit more space to read. And so having someone who says, take this, and that gets you hooked and allows you to make those spaces in your life, like that's a real blessing in your 20s. At least it would have been for me.
Yeah, definitely. Because so much of our reading in college and high school is like, oh, we have to read this. It's the last thing you want to do for fun. And I say that as an English major. So
I know, right? So, okay, we have a question that is so perfect for you that I almost feel like this person like wrote it for you. But okay, so this is from Meredith.
Are romance writers more likely to attempt to control their own fates through self-publishing and using social media to acquire loyal readers? I'm wondering also how Kindle Unlimited plays a part in all this. And what are the financial ramifications of having your books in Kindle Unlimited versus not?
All right, so we've talked a little bit about this controlling their own fates through self-publishing. I would love to hear more about the Kindle Unlimited part of this conversation.
Oh, that's great. I just wrote a paper about that not long ago.
Great.
So Kindle Unlimited has been great for some authors and absolutely terrible for others. It's been great for the authors who find readers who wouldn't have known about them and then want to consume all of their books. It has not been great for authors who have maybe one or two books out. They're aspiring romance writers. They've self-published a couple of books. They don't have a big catalog. So it's very, very hard because there's so many books, mostly self-published on KU.
Right.
It's very hard to break through the clutter. And this will not come as a surprise to anyone. Amazon actually benefits from that clutter.
Yeah.
Because now, if you want to succeed on KU, Kindle Unlimited, you really need to buy ads from Amazon. So Kindle Unlimited has created these income streams for Amazon that do not benefit the authors. If you sell a book, Amazon makes money, the publisher makes money. If it's self-published, there's no publisher, and you make money. But in buying ads to promote your book on KU and cut through the clutter, only Amazon makes money.
So can you zoom out a little bit and say, like, why would an author opt into Kindle Unlimited?
Exposure.
Got it.
KU is basically a streaming service for books. You pay a flat fee every month and you get to consume as many as you want. And that is fantastic for romance readers because romance readers read way more books than any other readers in America. They'll read often several books a week, whereas the average American reads a few books a year. Yeah. So KU does have this sort of captive audience of people who really just want things that are available on KU.
It reminds me of how we think about something like Spotify, right? Like a band wants their music to be on Spotify as a means to get potential exposure, to land on like a playlist that will then maybe get them some revenue, and maybe also generate enough of a fandom that then people will buy their tickets, right? To see them touring, which is how they actually make money. But they're not going to make money just having their music on Spotify. So it depends, like, you can see how it would really depend on the level of success that someone has. So, like, are any of, like, Colleen Hoover's books on Kindle Unlimited?
I actually don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is a lot of authors will put one or two of their books on KU for the minimum amount of time, like 3 months, hoping that it will drive them to buy the rest of their catalog as actual books. So that's a strategy that they'll use. One reason that a lot of people don't like to use KU is because when you put your book for sale on KU, you have to go exclusively with Amazon for the period of time that your book is there. So a lot of romance writers are increasingly objecting to that model. I was talking with a well-known author named Courtney Milan about this last year, and she said at that time she was not putting her books on KU, even though she as a well-known author could make a lot of money on KU because she does not want to support Amazon's near monopoly in this area.
Right. So other than individuals like that, is there any sort of organized effort to push back against that sort of power being leveraged by Amazon?
Yes. So Romance Writers of America, during the time that I was working on this book, RWA became a pretty controversial group. Very, very long story short, they were torn apart by the fact that they were just too slow to catch up with this massive cultural awakening. And for many years just did not do as much for their authors of color and their other historically minoritized authors as we now know they should have. And that led to this breakdown, and RWA now has less than half of the members that they once had because of this rift. That said, RWA was and still is one of the only large organizations that can stand up to Amazon. And they have. Amazon will return RWA's phone calls. Mm-hmm. They will not return a phone call from most authors. And RWA and organized romance authors have been influential in making some small but important changes at Amazon, like making it easier for authors who, for some reason, their books aren't appearing, for those books to appear. Amazon's algorithms do not show Black authors nearly as often as they show white authors, even when they should.
Yep.
RWA has worked really hard on that. The Authors Guild has also been really instrumental in standing up to Amazon's monopoly power.
Yeah, I think that it's one of those cases too where, and I deal with this all the time, honestly, with Substack, which is where this podcast is published. Like, you have these tools that make it easier to wrest back control from the industry at large. But sometimes you have to push back against the maker of those tools.
Mm-hmm. It's ironic.
Amazon makes it a lot easier to self-publish and to control your own destiny as a romance writer and to, accumulate the power that would not necessarily have been yours if you were trying to navigate the business at large. But at the same time, like, they are an incredibly cutthroat capitalist organization. And so to rely on that organization as your tool is always going to be very fraught.
Yeah, one author I spoke to compared Amazon to, it's like you're a tiny kitten being cuddled by a giant gorilla. You're happy that you're being cuddled by this gorilla, but it could crush you at any moment.
This is a great note for us to end on, except I have one last question for you, because we did a whole podcast about romances and I didn't ask you one of your favorites. So it doesn't have to be your all-time favorite, just one that comes to mind that you really love that you would recommend to listeners.
Well, I'll just say, most recently I read Cat Sebastian's We Could Be So Good, which is a historic, it's a male-male romance, and it's set in the early 1960s in the newspaper world of New York City. And as a journalist, I just loved it. And as a reader, Cat Sebastian is amazing with dialogue and character development.
That is a fantastic recommendation. Christine Larson, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find you if they want to hear more from you? And where would you recommend that they buy your book?
Well, I buy my book wherever you like. I would be delighted. It's called Love in the Time of Self-Publishing. You can find me at christinelarson.com, and I would love to hear from you.
Amazing. Now, if you were a paid subscriber, you'd be getting the Ask Anne Anything segment right now. This week, we're talking about the agony of unresolved friend breakups. If that sounds like advice that you need, or if you just want to support the pod and make it sustainable, head to culturestudypod.substack.com to sign up. Thank you so much for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, check the show notes for a link to our Substack. If you want to support the show and get bonus content, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive advice time segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod. Thank you so much for your support.